In modern medicine, there is a standard formula for predicting whether a patient will get better. We look at the drug, we look at the dose, and the specific diagnosis. Usually, those biological variables tell us exactly what to expect. But in recent clinical trials testing psychedelics for mental health, that standard formula breaks down. The dosage doesn't reliably predict a cure. The specific chemical doesn't guarantee a response. Instead, the most reliable indicator of who heals is something highly subjective. It is a deeply personal psychological state that clinicians call the mystical type experience. This finding has made traditional psychiatry extremely uncomfortable. For centuries, overwhelming sensations of universal unity and sacredness belonged entirely to religion and spirituality. They were the province of saints, not scientists. Now, neuroscience has to account for a specific clinical reality, a data-driven treatment where the most effective component appears to be a spiritual awakening. If you strip away the religious dogma, this peak state has a remarkably consistent structure across different cultures and eras. Early philosophers like William James mapped the hallmarks of this experience long before modern neuroscience existed. Then, in 2006, researchers led by Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins took a radical step. They gave healthy volunteers psilocybin in a controlled laboratory setting, proving they could reliably trigger this exact peak state on demand. The subjective impact on the volunteers was staggering. Months after the session, a majority of the participants rated the experience among the top 5 most meaningful events of their entire lives, often comparing it to the birth of a first child. To study this scientifically, researchers had to find a way to measure the unmeasurable. They developed a specific clinical tool called the MEQ30, a 30-question survey designed to put a hard number on the ineffable. This diagram shows exactly how the MEQ30 breaks down the experience. It categorizes deeply subjective feelings into distinct, measurable data buckets, tracking a patient's sense of unity, sacredness, a direct encounter with truth, the transcendence of time and space, and deeply positive mood. By forcing these abstract feelings into a quantified score, researchers could establish a threshold for a complete mystical experience. And more importantly, they finally had the hard data needed to test whether the psychological trip is what actually heals the brain. The data they gathered provided a very clear answer. Look at a 2018 study by researcher Robin Carhart-Harris and his team analyzing patients with treatment-resistant depression. This chart reveals a striking correlation. On one axis, we have oceanic boundlessness, the clinical term for that unitive, expansive feeling of connecting with everything. On the other axis, we see depression severity. As a patient's oceanic boundlessness score goes up, their subsequent drop in depression becomes much larger. The inverse is also true. Patients who experienced a high degree of panic, measured here as the dread of ego dissolution, or the fear of losing their sense of self, had a measurably worse therapeutic response. This correlation points toward the experience as the primary therapeutic driver. The drug triggers a state intense enough to shift a person's relationship to themselves. This brings us to the most significant debate currently dividing psychedelic medicine. Is this subjective experience the mechanism of healing, or is it just a correlated side effect? On one side is the biology-first camp, championed by chemist David Olson. Olson argues that the durable benefit comes from invisible neuroplasticity, the physical regrowth of synapses in the brain. In his view, this structural repair is what treats the depression, and the psychedelic trip is just an accidental hallucination layered on top. The ultimate goal for this side of the debate is to engineer non-hallucinogenic versions of these compounds. They want to trigger the physical brain repair and skip the heavy, unpredictable psychological trip entirely. On the other side is the experience-first camp, led by researchers like David Yaden and the late Roland Griffiths. Their primary defense is straightforward. So far, in every human trial we have, no human healing has been demonstrated without that profound, subjective psychological reset. Science is actively racing to resolve this mind-body divide. But for now, the data leaves us with one undeniable reality. This measurable, cross-cultural peak state currently remains our best predictor of who escapes the darkest psychological depths.